footsteps on cold marble. Usually that's all it takes to make the estate staff scatter like roaches. Conrad expected an empty hall, the familiar stench of lemon bleach, and the suffocating silence of his mother's wing. He didn't expect the melody. Low, raspy, bleeding through the heavy oak doors, and he certainly didn't expect to see his catatonic mother leaning into the touch of the new hire, an Omega boy who smelled like cheap laundry soap and burnt sugar. Rain slashed against the tinted windows of the town car, blurring the city into a smear of gray and bruised purple. Conrad Hayes rested his temple against the cold glass. His jaw ached. He'd been grinding his teeth again, a habit that flared up whenever the board members talked in circles. 2 meetings canceled, a migraine building at the base of his skull like a dull throb of a bass drum. He told his driver to take him home at 2 in the afternoon. He never came home at 2 in the afternoon. The Hayes estate was less a home and more a mausoleum. 3 stories of limestone and slate, bought with ruthless acquisitions and maintained by invisible people who worked for minimum wage. Conrad bypassed the grand double doors at the front. He keyed into the side entrance, stepping onto the mudroom's slate tiles. He shrugged off his wet cashmere coat, dropping it over a hook. It smelled of wet sheep and exhaust fumes. Silence swallowed him the moment the door clicked shut. It was a heavy, oppressive quiet, the kind that settled in your lungs and made it hard to breathe. Conrad loosened his silk tie, the fabric rasping against his collar. He just wanted a scotch. 2 fingers of Lagavulin, no ice, and the dark quiet of his study. He walked down the corridor, his leather soles clicking faintly. The air in the house was always temperature-controlled, perfectly 68 degrees, smelling faintly of synthetic lavender and dust. He paused at the intersection of the main hall and the east wing. The east wing belonged to Nora, his mother. 6 months ago, a stroke had hollowed her out, leaving behind a shell that stared at walls and breathed only because her autonomic nervous system hadn't forgotten how. Conrad paid exorbitant sums for private nurses, physical therapists, and specialists who spoke in hushed, pitying tones. They did nothing. She remained a ghost haunting her own body. Conrad squeezed his eyes shut, massaging the bridge of his nose. He intended to walk past. He always walked past on his bad days. He couldn't stomach the vacant look in her eyes when his own head felt like a cracked engine block. Then he heard it. A sound. Not the rhythmic hiss of the oxygen concentrator or the sterile squeak of a nurse's rubber-soled shoes. It was a voice. Conrad froze. His chest tightened, a spike of pure instinctual adrenaline hitting his bloodstream. His alpha biology, usually buried under layers of corporate stoicism and tailored suits, flared. Intruder. Unfamiliar. He turned his body toward the heavy oak double doors of his mother's sitting room. The voice grew clearer as he took slow, deliberate steps down the hall. Someone was singing. It wasn't a performance. It was a murmur, rough around the edges, entirely lacking professional polish. The voice cracked slightly on the higher notes, dropping into a low, chesty hum. It was an old folk song, a song about rivers and leaving home. Conrad reached the door. It was cracked open an inch. He placed his palm flat against the wood, the varnish cool against his skin. He pushed. The hinges groaned quietly. The sitting room was usually kept dark, the velvet curtains drawn tight to prevent the afternoon sun from fading the antique rugs. But today, the heavy drapes were pulled back, tying the room in harsh, unforgiving daylight. Dust motes drifted lazily in the bright shafts. In the center of the room, seated in her floral armchair, was Nora, but it was the figure on the floor that made Conrad's breath catch in his throat. A boy. Young, maybe 22, wearing the standard-issue gray polo and black slacks of the estate's cleaning staff. He was sitting cross-legged on the Persian rug, leaning back against the base of Nora's armchair. He held a feather duster loosely in one hand, completely forgotten. The boy's head was tilted back, resting against the upholstery right next to Nora's knee. And Nora, who hadn't moved a muscle voluntarily since October, had her pale, trembling hand resting on the boy's messy brown hair. Conrad stared, His heart slammed against his ribs. The boy kept singing, his eyes closed. His throat vibrated with the low notes. He smelled distinct. Beneath the chemical harshness of lemon pledge and bleach, there was a scent. Sweet, but singed at the edges, like caramelized sugar left on the stove a few seconds too long. An omega. An unbonded, exhausted omega. Nora's fingers twitched. They clumsily stroked the boy's hair, catching on the tangled strands. The boy didn't flinch. He just leaned into the touch, letting his song taper off into a soft, melodic hum. "There you go, Mrs. Hayes," the boy whispered, his voice gravelly. "Not so bad today, is it? The rain's nice when you don't have to stand in it." Conrad felt a violent surge of conflicting emotions. Rage, hot and blinding, that this stranger, this nobody cleaner, was in a restricted area touching his mother. And underneath the rage, a cold, suffocating wave of jealousy. Conrad had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to get his mother to look at him, to recognize him. This boy just sat on the floor, and she moved for him. "What?" Conrad said, his voice dropping into a harsh, unnatural baritone. "Are you doing?" The boy violently jerked awake from his relaxed posture. The feather duster clattered to the hardwood border of the rug. He scrambled backward, his sneakers squeaking sharply against the floorboards. As he moved, Nora's hand slipped from his hair and fell limply back to her lap. She let out a small, breathless sound, a whimper. Conrad's eyes darted to his mother, his stomach twisting, before snapping back to the omega. The boy was on his feet now, chest heaving, his eyes were wide, the color of dirty river water, greenish-brown and panicked. The smell in the room shifted instantly. The burnt sugar soured, turning sharp and acidic with sheer terror. The omega's scent glands, right at the base of his neck, were practically flooding the room with distress signals. Mr. Hayes," the boy stammered, wiping sweaty palms on his cheap polyester slacks. "I'm sorry, I was just the dustboards. I was doing the baseboards." Conrad stepped fully into the room. He let the heavy oak door click shut behind him. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet space. He didn't mean to release his own pheromones, but he was tired. His head pounded, and his territory had been breached. The sharp, bitter scent of ozone and crushed black pepper rolled off him. The boy choked on it, taking another step back until his shoulder blades hit the mahogany bookshelf. He lowered his eyes immediately, exposing the vulnerable curve of his neck in a hardwired, instinctual submission. It made Conrad's stomach roll with disgust, mostly at himself. "The baseboards," Conrad repeated. His voice was flat, dead. He walked closer, his leather shoes sinking into the rug. "You were cleaning the baseboards with your eyes closed, singing camp songs." "I was finished," the boy said quickly, his voice cracking. He swallowed hard. "The nurse, Brenda, she stepped out to take a phone call. She said she'd be gone 5 minutes. It's been 40. Mrs. Hayes she was making noises, like she was scared. I just sat down so she could see I wasn't going to hurt her." Conrad stopped 3 feet away. Up close, the boy looked even more ragged. Dark circles bruised the skin under his eyes. His gray polo was a size too big, the collar frayed. His knuckles were red and raw from industrial cleaning supplies. Toby. That was the name stitched onto the crooked name tag over his chest. Toby. "Brenda left her alone," Conrad stated, the anger finding a new, more deserving target. Toby nodded quickly, still staring at Conrad's shoes. "She does it a lot, sir. Goes to the terrace to smoke and talk on the phone. I usually just clean around her, but today Mrs. Hayes seemed agitated." Conrad looked at his mother. Nora was staring at the wall again, the brief flash of life completely extinguished. Her hand lay flat on her thigh, unmoving. The absolute stillness of her was a stark contrast to the vibrating anxiety of the boy pinned against the bookshelf. "So you sang to her," Conrad said. It wasn't a question, but he needed to hear the confirmation. He needed to understand the mechanics of what he had just witnessed. Toby finally looked up, his jaw set, a tiny flare of defiance cutting through the heavy blanket of his fear. It calms my little sister down when she gets worked up. I didn't know what else to do. You can fire me, Mr. Hayes. I know I'm not supposed to engage with the family. Just don't dock my pay for today. Please, I really need this week's check. He was expecting to be thrown out onto the wet asphalt. He was already doing the math on how he would survive the week. Conrad could see it behind the dirty river eyes. The cynical calculus of poverty. Conrad reached up and rubbed his temples. The migraine was fully blooming now, sharp spikes of pain driving behind his left eye. He breathed in. The air was a chaotic mess. Sour omega fear, aggressive alpha pepper, the sterile smell of the house, and beneath it all, the lingering warmth of that caramelized sugar scent. It was entirely too much sensory input. I'm not firing you, Conrad said roughly. Toby blinked. The scent of panic plateaued, turning into profound confusion. You're not? No. Conrad turned his back on the boy, walking over to Nora. He crouched beside her chair, his knees popping. He reached out and touched her hand. It was ice cold, limp. He waited for her fingers to twitch, to grasp his hand the way she had grasped Toby's hair. Nothing, not a single spark of recognition. Conrad swallowed the bitter ash of disappointment. He stood up, towering over the sitting room. He looked back at the Omega. Toby was still pressed against the books, clutching his dirty feather duster like a weapon. Go to the kitchen, Conrad ordered, his tone slipping back into the icy cadence he used in boardrooms. Tell the head housekeeper you're no longer on general cleaning duty. You are reassigned. Toby's brow furrowed. Reassigned to what, sir? To this wing, Conrad said. He hated the words as they left his mouth, hated the loss of control, hated the desperate hope blooming in his chest. You're going to sit here, and you're going to sing. The kitchen was a chaotic symphony of clattering stainless steel pans and raised voices. When Toby pushed through the swinging doors carrying his bucket of supplies, the noise didn't stop. He was invisible here. Just another drone in a gray shirt. He set the bucket down by the utility sink, his hands shaking so badly the handle rattled against the plastic. He leaned over the deep basin, gripping the edges, and dragged in a ragged breath. His lungs still burned from the alpha pheromones upstairs. Conrad Hayes smelled like a thunderstorm trapped in a bottle, suffocating, electric, and terrifyingly dominant. Toby turned on the cold tap and splashed water onto his face. The chill shocked his system, bringing him back down to earth, reassigned. It made no sense. Rich people didn't do things like this. They fired you. They called security and had you escorted out the back entrance so the neighbors wouldn't see. They didn't promote you for getting caught slacking off on the floor of a sick woman's bedroom. Hey, you're blocking the sink. Toby jumped, wiping his face with the sleeve of his polo. Maria, one of the prep cooks, was glaring at him over a colander of washed spinach. Sorry, Toby mumbled, stepping aside. He needed to find Mrs. Gable, the head housekeeper. He needed to figure out if what just happened was real or if the CEO was playing some kind of sadistic corporate game. He found Mrs. Gable in her small office just off the pantry, aggressively typing on a sleek laptop. She was a stern beta woman who smelled like starch and peppermint, and she ruled the staff with an iron fist. Toby knocked on the open door frame. Excuse me, Mrs. Gable. She didn't look up. If you need more bleach, requisition it through the tablet in the laundry room, Toby. I'm doing payroll. It's not bleach, it's Mr. Hayes. Her fingers stopped. She slowly raised her head, adjusting her reading glasses. The annoyance on her face shifted into a sharp, guarded alertness. You spoke with Mr. Hayes? He spoke to me, Toby corrected, suddenly hyper-aware of how dirty his uniform was. He came home early. I was in the East Wing, cleaning the baseboards in his mother's room. Toby swallowed hard. Best not to mention the singing or the hair stroking. He told me to tell you I'm reassigned to the East Wing. Mrs. Gable stared at him, the silence stretched, heavy, and judgmental. Reassigned to do what? The private nurses handle Nora's care. I don't know, Toby lied, looking down at his worn sneakers. He just said I'm staying in that wing now. Mrs. Gable picked up the desk phone and dialed a 3-digit extension. She waited, her eyes never leaving Toby's face. Mr. Hayes, apologies for the interruption. Toby Reese is in my office claiming... Yes, sir, I understand. Effective immediately? Very well. She hung up the phone. For a long moment, she just looked at Toby, her expression unreadable. Well, she said finally, her voice tight. It seems you've had a promotion. You're to report to the East Wing every morning at 8. You will assist the nurses with Mrs. Hayes, reading to her, keeping her company, basically a glorified babysitter. She scoffed quietly. Minimum wage plus $4 an hour. Go change out of that wet shirt, Reese. You start tomorrow. Toby walked out of the office in a daze. $4 more an hour. It wasn't a fortune, but it meant he could actually afford the heating bill this month. It meant he wouldn't have to water down the milk for his sister's cereal. Upstairs, in the master study, Conrad poured his scotch. The glass clinked against the crystal decanter, the sound sharp and lonely in the massive room. He walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the manicured gardens that were currently drowning in the rain. He took a sip. The amber liquid burned down his throat, a familiar, harsh comfort. He was out of his mind. He knew he was. You don't put a 20-something untrained cleaner in charge of a medically fragile stroke victim because he knows the lyrics to a folk song. It was a massive liability. If the board found out, if the society papers found out, they'd say the stress had finally cracked him. But Conrad couldn't get the image out of his head. His mother's hand, frail and bruised with IV marks, resting gently in that boy's brown hair, the peaceful slack of her jaw. For 10 minutes she hadn't been a shell. She had been human. Conrad swirled the liquor in his glass. He remembered the boy's smell, sour panic turning the burnt sugar bitter. Toby had been terrified of him. Everyone was terrified of him. It was how Conrad survived the corporate bloodbath. He was the alpha who didn't blink, who didn't yield. But down in that sitting room, standing over the frightened Omega, Conrad hadn't felt powerful. He had felt useless. A billionaire who couldn't buy his mother's soul back, watching a kid who probably couldn't afford a hot lunch achieve a miracle with nothing but a raspy voice. Conrad downed the rest of his drink. The burn settled heavy in his stomach. Tomorrow the boy would be back in the East Wing, and Conrad, for the first time in 6 months, found himself wanting to go home early again. Morning light offered no warmth in the East Wing. It filtered through the UV-coated windows, casting a sterile, pale glare over the antique furniture. Toby stood at the threshold of Nora Hayes' sitting room, his stomach tied in tight, painful knots. He was wearing a fresh uniform, the same cheap gray polo and black slacks, but scrubbed clean of the usual grease and chemical stains. He felt entirely out of place. A stray dog suddenly allowed to sit on the silk sofa. Brenda, the day nurse, was already there. She was a thick-set beta woman with a no-nonsense bun and a scrub top patterned with cartoon bears that felt obscenely cheerful for a room that smelled like slow death. She was adjusting the flow rate on Nora's oxygen concentrator, her movements sharp and clinical. She paused and looked over her shoulder as Toby's rubber soles squeaked on the hardwood border. Her eyes swept over him, cataloging the frayed collar of his shirt and the cheap watch on his wrist. "So," Brenda said, her voice dry, "you're the new therapy." Toby swallowed the lump in his throat. He kept his eyes lowered, an automatic defense mechanism. "Mrs. Gable said I'm supposed to sit with her." "Sit with her," Brenda repeated, shaking her head. She picked up a blood pressure cuff. "Well, stay out of my way. I have actual medical protocols to run. Don't touch the IV, don't adjust her pillows without asking, and for God's sake, don't get your cleaning chemicals on the sterile drapes." "I don't have chemicals anymore," Toby said quietly. He held up his hands. They were empty. No feather duster, no bucket. He didn't know what to do with them. Brenda just snorted, turning back to the catatonic woman in the chair. Nora looked exactly the same as yesterday. Vacant. Hollow. Her pale blue eyes were fixed on a spot on the opposite wall, blinking only when her brainstem forced the reflex. Toby walked to the edge of the Persian rug. He hesitated, then lowered himself cross-legged onto the floor, exactly where he had been yesterday. The wool scratched against his bare ankles. He looked up at Nora. Up close, without the immediate panic of the CEO breathing down his neck, the devastation of her stroke was staggering. The right side of her face drooped slightly. Her skin was paper-thin, mapping a fragile network of blue and purple veins. "Hi, Mrs. Hayes," Toby murmured. Brenda clucked her tongue. "She doesn't hear you, kid. The cognitive pathways are fried. You're talking to a brick wall." Toby ignored her. He leaned his back against the base of the armchair. The silence in the room stretched, punctuated only by the rhythmic hiss-click of the oxygen machine. Minutes crawled by. Toby felt stupid. The back of his neck burned. He was supposed to do something. The Alpha CEO was paying him an extra $4 an hour to perform a miracle, and Toby was just a tired Omega from the South Side who barely graduated high school. He closed his eyes. He thought of his little sister Maya, crying in their cramped, drafty apartment when the thunder got too loud. He thought of the heavy, suffocating pressure of the Hayes estate. He drew in a slow breath, letting it fill his belly, and opened his mouth. He didn't sing the folk song this time. He chose an old lullaby his mother used to hum before she disappeared. It was a mournful tune, slow and dragging, meant to lull a restless mind into submission. His voice was gravelly this morning, lacking the smooth resonance of a trained singer. It cracked on the first note. He kept going, low, steady, vibrating in his chest. He waited for the hand in his hair. He waited for the rustle of fabric. Nothing happened. Toby finished the first verse and opened his eyes. Nora hadn't moved an inch. Her hands remained limp in her lap. Her gaze was still locked on the blank wall. A cold spike of dread hit Toby's stomach. Yesterday was a fluke, a random muscular spasm that coincided with his singing. He wasn't special. He was a fraud, and as soon as Conrad Hayes found out, Toby would be fired. Not reassigned, fired. Out on the street with $80 in his checking account and a sister who needed winter boots. His scent spiked with sharp, sour anxiety. The burnt sugar smell turned bitter, flooding the immediate area around the chair. 30 miles away, in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the gray sprawl of the city, Conrad Hayes abruptly stopped speaking. He stood at the head of a long mahogany table, a laser pointer idle in his hand, a quarterly projection chart glowing on the screen behind him. 12 board members, mostly aging alphas and a few sharp-eyed betas, stared at him. Conrad's jaw was locked. The air in the room was heavily filtered, smelling of expensive cologne, dry cleaning chemicals, and the subtle competitive tang of alpha pheromones. But Conrad wasn't smelling any of it. He was smelling something that wasn't there. A phantom scent of caramelized sugar singed at the edges. It was a hallucination brought on by stress and sleep deprivation. He knew that. His logical brain, the brain that manipulated stock prices and gutted failing subsidiaries, told him it was a biological misfire, but his chest still felt tight. A low, restless hum vibrated under his skin. "Conrad?" asked Richard, the CFO, a heavy-set alpha with a comb-over. "Are we moving to the Q3 acquisitions?" Conrad stared blankly at the spreadsheet. The numbers looked like dead bugs smeared across the screen. He placed the laser pointer on the table. The small click echoed in the quiet room. "We're rescheduling," Conrad said. His voice was a flat, uncompromising baritone. Richard blinked. "Rescheduling? Sir, the shareholders' meeting is next week. We need to align on—" I said, "We are rescheduling." Conrad picked up his suit jacket from the back of his chair. He didn't look at any of them. The instinct to leave, to return to his territory, was suddenly overwhelming. It clawed at the back of his mind, primal and irrational. He walked out of the glass room, leaving a dozen confused executives in his wake. As he strode down the carpeted hallway toward the private elevators, he pulled out his phone. He brought up the estate's security application, bypassing the perimeter cameras, bypassing the front door, and tapping directly into the East Wing hallway feed. No audio, just a grainy, silent video of a heavy oak door. Conrad stared at the screen all the way down to the underground parking garage. He didn't know what he was expecting to see. The door didn't move. He climbed into the back of his waiting town car. "Home," he told the driver. He leaned his head against the headrest, closing his eyes. The migraine was back, a familiar dull throb. He was losing his grip on his own life, and the terrifying part was, he didn't care. He just wanted the quiet of that sitting room. He just wanted to see if the ghost in the chair would reach out and touch the boy again. Thursday was a bad day. Toby learned quickly that catatonia wasn't just a peaceful, permanent sleep. It was a failing nervous system. It was violent, unpredictable glitches in a broken machine. It started raining again just after lunch, a torrential downpour that battered the UV-coated windows. The atmospheric pressure change seemed to agitate Nora. Her breathing grew shallow and rapid. Her fingers, usually limp, curled into tight, rigid claws against her thighs. Toby sat in his usual spot on the floor, his knees pulled to his chest. He had been singing for 2 hours straight. His throat felt like sandpaper. He had cycled through every song he knew, lullabies, radio pop songs from 10 years ago, even a few commercial jingles. Nothing worked. The magic of that first day remained stubbornly out of reach. "Stop the caterwauling," Brenda snapped from across the room. She was charting numbers on a tablet, her face pinched with irritation. "You're stressing her out, and you're giving me a headache." Toby snapped his mouth shut. He rested his chin on his knees, feeling a miserable wave of uselessness wash over him. His throat ached. He watched Nora. Her chest heaved unevenly. A low, guttural moan slipped past her lips. It was a terrifying sound, devoid of humanity, an animal trapped in a snare. "She's hurting," Toby whispered. The smell of the room was changing. The sterile scent of bleach was being overwhelmed by the sharp, acidic tang of an elderly Omega in distress. It triggered something deep and empathetic in Toby's own biology, a hardwired urge to soothe, to nest, to fix. "She's not hurting, she's just having a neurological misfire," Brenda said coldly. She set the tablet down and walked over. "Her muscles are cramping. I need to adjust her positioning." Brenda leaned over the armchair. She grabbed Nora by the shoulders, attempting to haul the dead weight upward to fix the pillows. She wasn't gentle. It was the rough, efficient movement of someone who moved bodies for a living. Nora let out a sharper, louder wail. Her arm flailed outward, a sudden violent spasm. Her hand struck the small side table next to the chair. A heavy crystal water glass tipped over, rolling off the edge. It hit the hardwood border of the floor with a sharp crack, shattering into jagged shards. Water splashed across Toby's sneakers. "Damn it!" Brenda hissed, stepping back. "Don't just sit there, kid. Clean that up before I step on it. I need to get her muscle relaxants." She spun on her heel, her rubber shoes squeaking, and marched out of the room toward the medical supply closet down the hall. Toby scrambled onto his knees. He didn't have his cleaning cart. He didn't have a broom. He stared at the broken crystal and the puddle of water seeping into the edge of the expensive Persian rug. Nora was whimpering now, her head rolling side to side against the upholstery. Panic gripped Toby. He had to clean it up. He had to be useful. He crawled forward on the wood floor and started picking up the large shards with his bare hands. The water made the glass slippery. He stacked the pieces carefully on the dry section of the floor. "Shh, it's okay," Toby murmured to Nora, trying to keep his voice steady while his hand shook. "I've got it. Just an accident." He reached for a small, sharp sliver resting near the leg of the table. His fingers fumbled. The wet glass slid, slicing deep into the pad of his index finger. Toby hissed, jerking his hand back. Blood welled up instantly, a bright, shocking crimson against his pale skin. It dripped, hitting the puddle of water and blooming into pink clouds. Before he could reach in his pocket for a napkin, the heavy oak doors swung open. Conrad Hayes stood in the doorway. He was drenched. His expensive wool suit was dark with rain at the shoulders, his hair plastered to his forehead. He looked wild. He had driven himself today, ditching the driver, taking the corners too fast. He froze, taking in the chaotic scene. His mother thrashing weakly in the chair, the overturned table, the broken glass, and the Omega on his knees, clutching a bleeding hand. The scent of blood hit Conrad's nose. Fresh Omega blood, mixed with the sharp, overwhelming spike of Toby's terrified, burnt sugar pheromones. It was like a match dropped into a powder keg. Conrad didn't think. The CEO vanished. The alpha took over. The protective, territorial instincts that modern society demanded he suppress surged to the surface with violent force. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, his wet shoes leaving dark prints on the rug. Toby scrambled backward, his eyes wide with raw terror. The alpha was coming at him, eyes dark, jaw clenched, emitting an oppressive wave of ozone and black pepper that made it hard to breathe. Toby hit the base of the bookshelf, clutching his bleeding hand to his chest, exposing his neck in complete submission. "I'm sorry," Toby choked out, shrinking in on himself. "She knocked it over, I was just—" Conrad dropped to his knees. The expensive fabric of his suit pants soaked up the spilled water. He didn't care. He reached out and grabbed Toby's wrist. Toby flinched violently, expecting a blow, expecting to be dragged out. Instead, Conrad's grip was shockingly gentle. His large, warm hand enveloped Toby's thin wrist, his thumb pressing against the rapid, frantic pulse. Conrad stared at the blood dripping from Toby's finger. The contrast between them was absolute. Conrad's hands were immaculate, manicured, smooth. Toby's hands were red, calloused, the cuticles bitten raw from anxiety. "You're bleeding," Conrad said. His voice was a low, dangerous rumble. It wasn't angry. It was intensely focused. Toby stared at him, bewildered. "It's just a scratch. I can clean it." "Brenda," Conrad barked, his voice carrying down the hall. A moment later, the nurse appeared in the doorway, a syringe in her hand. She stopped dead, staring at the billionaire kneeling on the wet floor, holding the maid's hand. "Sir," Brenda stammered, "I was just getting her medication. She had a spasm." "Get a towel. Clean up the glass," Conrad ordered, his eyes never leaving Toby's face. "And sedate my mother. Gently." Without another word, Conrad stood up, pulling Toby up with him. Toby stumbled, his legs shaky from the adrenaline drop. Conrad didn't let go of his wrist. He turned and pulled the Omega out of the sitting room, down the long, silent corridor toward the master suite. Toby stumbled after him, his bleeding hand held awkwardly between them. The scent of rain, wool, and angry alpha filled his lungs, terrifying and strangely intoxicating. He had no idea what was happening. He only knew that the ground beneath his feet had fundamentally shifted. The master suite was a cavernous space of dark wood, slate-gray walls, and heavy silence. It felt less like a bedroom and more like a high-end hotel suite waiting for a guest who never arrived. Conrad dragged Toby past the massive king-sized bed and pushed open the frosted glass door of the master bathroom. He flicked a switch. Blinding, clinical white light flooded the room, illuminating marble counters and a soaking tub large enough for 3 people. Conrad released Toby's wrist and turned to the sink. He twisted the heavy chrome handle. Warm water hissed from the faucet. "Here," Conrad ordered, pointing to the stream. Toby stood frozen near the doorframe. He felt like an intruder committing a capital offense. His cheap clothes were damp from the floor. His finger throbbed. "Mr. Hayes, I can go to the kitchen. There's a first aid kit under the utility sink." "Put your hand under the water, Toby." It was the first time Conrad had used his name. The sound of it, spoken in that low, rough baritone, sent a shiver down Toby's spine. Slowly, reluctantly, Toby stepped up to the marble counter. He extended his bleeding hand under the warm stream. The water washed away the bright red, revealing a deep, clean slice across the pad of his finger. It stung fiercely. Toby bit his lip, suppressing a hiss. Conrad stood right beside him, too close. Toby could feel the heat radiating from the alpha's body. He could smell the damp wool of his suit, the expensive leather of his watch strap, and underneath it all the heavy grounding scent of black pepper and ozone. It was suffocating, but it was also overriding Toby's panic, forcing his Omega biology to calm down and submit to the alpha's presence. Conrad opened a mirrored cabinet, grabbing a bottle of iodine and a box of heavy-duty bandages. He uncapped the iodine. "Give it to me," Conrad said. Toby pulled his hand out of the water, shaking. Conrad caught his hand, his long, warm fingers wrapping securely around Toby's palm. The physical contact was electric. A jolt of pure, instinctual recognition flared between them, sudden and sharp. Conrad's hand twitched. He felt it too. The soft, callous texture of the Omega's skin, the frantic pulse at his wrist, the overwhelming scent of burnt sugar that was finally losing its sour edge of fear. Conrad stared at the hand he was holding. He realized, with a sickening drop in his stomach, that he didn't want to let go. He was losing his mind. Conrad poured the dark brown iodine over the cut. Toby gasped, trying to jerk his hand back. "Ow! God!" Conrad's grip tightened, holding him in place. "Hold still." His voice was harsh, trying to mask the chaotic storm of his own instincts. He took a sterile gauze pad and firmly pressed it against the wound, staunching the bleeding. They stood there in the bright, silent bathroom. The only sound was the running water and Toby's ragged breathing. Toby stared at the side of Conrad's face. The sharp line of his jaw, the dark stubble shadowing his chin, the heavy exhaustion bruising his eyes. He looked like a man carrying a mountain on his back. "Why did you bring me in here?" Toby asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The defense mechanisms were slipping. The sheer absurdity of the situation stripped away his usual deference. "I'm the maid. You have medical staff downstairs. You have a whole house of people." Conrad slowly wrapped a bandage around the gauze, securing it tight. "You're not the maid anymore. You're assigned to my mother." "I failed today," Toby said bluntly. The raw honesty surprised even him, but he couldn't stop. The fatigue was eating him alive. "I sat there for 2 hours. I sang until I couldn't swallow. She didn't move, Mr. Hayes. Yesterday was a fluke. I'm not magic. I'm just a guy who needs a paycheck." Conrad stopped. He looked up, his dark eyes locking onto Toby's greenish-brown ones. The intensity of his gaze pinned Toby to the floor. "I know you're not magic," Conrad said quietly. "I know her brain is dying." "Then why?" Toby's voice cracked. "Why are you paying me to sit on the floor? Why are you holding my hand?" The question hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. Conrad looked down at his own hands. He was still gripping Toby's palm. He slowly uncurled his fingers, stepping back, putting a crucial 2 feet of distance between them. The loss of heat made Toby shiver. Conrad turned off the faucet. He leaned his hips against the marble counter, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked at Toby. Really looked at him. The frayed collar, the dark bags under his eyes, the defiant, terrified set of his jaw. "Everyone in this house," Conrad started, his voice flat, devoid of the corporate polish, "speaks to me in whispers. They manage me. They give me statistics on her decline. They offer me pity." Conrad looked toward the frosted glass door, staring at nothing. "Yesterday, I saw you sitting on the floor. You weren't managing her. You weren't fixing her. You were just there. You treated her like she was still human." He looked back at Toby. "I don't care if she never touches your hair again. I don't care if she never moves. I need someone in that room who isn't waiting for her to die." Toby stared at him. The cynical, hardened exterior of the billionaire CEO had cracked, revealing a desperate, drowning son. In Toby's pocket, his cheap, cracked cell phone vibrated briefly. A text message. Probably his neighbor, letting him know Maya was home from school. It was a harsh pullback to reality. The billionaire's grief was a luxury. Toby's survival was a daily grind. "I have a sister," Toby said suddenly. He didn't know why he offered the information. "She's 10. If I lose this job, we lose the apartment. I'll sit in that room as long as you pay me, Mr. Hayes. But don't expect me to save her. And don't—" Toby swallowed hard, looking at his bandaged finger. "Don't do this again. Don't touch me like that. We both know how the biology works. I can't afford that kind of mess." Conrad's jaw tightened. The rejection, practical and grounded in brutal poverty, stung more than he anticipated. The Omega wasn't swooning. The Omega was calculating his rent. "Understood," Conrad said coldly, the CEO mask slamming back into place. "Go back to the East Wing. Brenda should be finished by now." Toby nodded once. He turned and walked out of the bathroom, his rubber soles squeaking faintly against the slate floor. Conrad remained leaning against the sink. He closed his eyes and breathed in deeply. The bathroom still smelled of iodine, wet wool, and the lingering sweet scent of burnt sugar. He had set the boundaries. Toby had drawn the line. It was a simple transactional arrangement, but as Conrad stood alone in the bright, sterile room, his hand still tingling with the ghost of the Omega's touch, he knew with absolute certainty that he was going to cross that line. It was only a matter of time. Coffee from the staff kitchen always tasted like burnt aluminum. Toby sat cross-legged on the Persian rug, nursing a styrofoam cup, letting the bitter heat ground him. 3 weeks had passed since the incident with the broken glass. 21 days of the same suffocating routine. He arrived at 8, endured Brenda's thinly veiled disdain, and sat on the floor beside Nora's chair. He sang until his throat felt raw. He read old paperback novels out loud, cheap thrillers and dog-eared fantasy books he picked up from the corner bodega, simply to fill the dead air. Nora never reached for him again. Her decline was a slow, agonizing descent, a fading of a photograph left out in the harsh sun. But the room had changed. A sleek black laptop now sat permanently on the antique mahogany writing desk in the corner. Conrad Hayes no longer stayed at the corporate office until 9 at night. By 3 in the afternoon, the heavy oak doors would swing open. He would walk in, usually shedding a perfectly tailored suit jacket, loosening a silk tie, and taking his place at the desk. He rarely spoke. He just typed, the rapid, rhythmic clatter of the keys blending with the mechanical hiss of the oxygen concentrator. It was an oppressive, heavy intimacy. Toby felt the Alpha's presence like a physical weight pressing against the back of his neck. Today, rain lashed against the UV-coated windows again, a relentless November downpour. Toby was halfway through Chapter 12 of a battered detective novel, his voice a low, raspy drone. Nora was asleep, or at least her eyes were closed, her breathing a shallow rattle. Toby's cheap cell phone vibrated violently against his thigh. He jumped, losing his page. He yanked it from his pocket, silencing the buzz. The cracked screen illuminated a text from his neighbor, Mrs. Higgins. Maya's school called. Fever. Vomiting. They want her picked up now. I'm on my shift at the diner. You need to go. Cold dread flooded Toby's veins. He stared at the glowing letters. He couldn't leave. If he left early, Mrs. Gable would dock his pay. Worse, she might tell Conrad he was unreliable. But Maya was 10 years old, sick, and sitting in a hard plastic chair in a school nurse's office across town. His scent betrayed him. The mild, sweet smell of burnt sugar spiked, turning sharp and frantic, leaking panic into the temperature-controlled air. At the desk, the typing stopped. Conrad slowly turned in his chair. He didn't look angry. He looked hyper-focused, his dark eyes locking onto the tense line of Toby's shoulders. The Alpha caught the distress immediately. It pulled a low, involuntary rumble from Conrad's chest, a biological imperative to locate the threat. "What is it?" Conrad demanded, his voice slicing through the quiet room. Toby scrambled to his feet, shoving the phone into his pocket. "Nothing. I need to make a phone call. I need to take a break. 5 minutes, I swear. You are shaking, Conrad observed. He stood up. He was wearing a dark gray cashmere sweater today, pushing up the sleeves, exposing corded forearms. He crossed the room, stopping just outside Toby's personal space. The scent of ozone and black pepper rolled off him, heavy and demanding. Tell me. It's my sister, Toby blurted out, the words tumbling over each other. He hated how small he sounded. He hated the power dynamic. Her school called. She's sick. I don't have anyone to pick her up. I just need to call a cab, maybe beg the nurse to wait. Give me the address. Toby blinked. What? The school, Toby. Give me the address. Conrad reached into his pocket and pulled out his own phone, unlocking it with a swipe of his thumb. Mr. Hayes, no, I can figure it out. I'm not asking for a favor. I'm not doing you a favor, Conrad said flatly. I'm ensuring you stay in this room where I'm paying you to be. Address. Now. Toby swallowed his pride. It tasted like ash. He rattled off the name of the underfunded public school on the south side. Conrad tapped a single button, putting the phone to his ear. Marcus, Conrad said. The driver. There is a middle school on 4th and Elm. Go to the front office. Pick up a child named Maya Reese. Take her to the private clinic on 52nd. Put everything on my account. Call me when she's in a bed. He hung up, sliding the phone back into his pocket. He looked at Toby. Toby felt a hot, humiliating tear prick the corner of his eye. He wiped it away furiously with the back of his hand. It was too much, the casual display of wealth, the immediate solving of a problem that would have cost Toby his week's grocery budget and his sanity. You didn't have to do that, Toby whispered, his voice cracking. I can't pay you back for a private clinic. I don't want your money, Conrad said softly. The corporate mask slipped entirely, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. He looked down at Nora, then back at Toby. Sit down. Read your book. Your sister is fine. Toby slowly sank back onto the rug. He picked up the paperback, but his hands were shaking so badly the words blurred on the page. He drew in a breath. The sharp ozone of the alpha had softened, mellowing into something warm, protective. For the first time since he took the job, Toby didn't feel like a hostage in the East Wing. He felt anchored. Death did not arrive with a quiet sigh. It tore its way into the house at 2 a.m, ugly and violent. Toby was dozing in a guest bedroom down the hall from the East Wing. A blizzard had buried the city under 2 feet of snow, effectively shutting down the transit system. Conrad had ordered him to stay, a directive Toby was too exhausted to fight. The mattress was too soft, the sheets too clean. He had spent hours staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind howl against the stone facade. Then the alarm blared. It was a shrill, piercing electronic shriek from the medical monitors in Nora's room. Toby shot out of bed, his heart hammering against his ribs. He hit the hallway running, his bare feet slapping against the cold hardwood. The double doors were thrown wide open. Chaos reigned in the sitting room. Brenda was shouting into her phone, her cartoon bear scrub top illuminated by the harsh overhead lights she had flicked on. Nora was convulsing. It wasn't the slow, rigid cramping of the past few weeks. It was a terrifying, full-body seizure. Her head cracked repeatedly against the padded arm of the chair. The oxygen tube had ripped away from her face, hissing uselessly onto the rug. Conrad was there. He was wearing dark sweatpants and a rumpled t-shirt, his hair wild. He was frozen. The man who ruthlessly dismantled corporations, the alpha who commanded rooms with a single glance, was rooted to the floor. His hands were hovering uselessly over his mother, afraid to touch her, afraid to break her further. The ambulance is stuck, Brenda yelled over the alarm, tossing her phone onto the sofa. The plows haven't cleared the main road. We need to get her on the floor. Now, help me. Conrad didn't move. His breathing was rapid, shallow. The room was flooding with an aggressive, choking wave of alpha panic. It smelled like burning electrical wire and crushed stone. It was so intense it made Toby's eyes water, a biological command to flee. Toby didn't flee. He lunged forward, sliding to his knees beside the chair. "Grab her shoulders," Toby barked at Brenda, completely ignoring the hierarchy. He hooked his arms under Nora's frail, thrashing legs. On three. 1, 2, 3. Together, they heaved her off the chair. She hit the Persian rug hard, but Toby managed to slide his own thigh under her head, protecting her skull from the hardwood border. She was shaking violently, her eyes rolled back. White foam gathered at the corners of her mouth. "She's choking," Toby gasped, trying to turn her head to the side. Brenda was already there, forcing Nora's jaw open, clearing the airway with professional ruthlessness. Toby looked up. Conrad was still standing above them. The alpha's face was completely drained of blood, a sickly gray. He was trembling. The smell of his terror was unbearable. Toby acted on pure blind instinct. He reached out with his free hand and grabbed Conrad's ankle. He squeezed hard. "Mr. Hayes," Toby said. His voice was remarkably steady, though his own heart was trying to break through his sternum. "Conrad, look at me." Conrad's dark, hollow eyes slowly dragged downward, locking onto Toby's face. "Sit down," Toby ordered. It was a terrible breach of etiquette, an Omega giving a direct command to an Alpha. "Sit down before you pass out, and I have to drag you too." Conrad collapsed. He didn't sit. His knees simply gave out. He landed hard on the rug beside Toby. He reached out, his large, shaking hands gripping Toby's shoulder, burying his face into the curve of Toby's neck. The contact was a shock to Toby's system. The Alpha was freezing cold, shivering violently against him. Toby didn't push him away. He let Nora's head rest securely on his leg, and he wrapped his free arm around Conrad's broad shoulders, pulling him tight. He consciously forced his own scent glands to open, flooding the space around them with the heavy, sweet scent of warm caramel. Calm. Safety. He pushed the pheromones out until he felt dizzy with the effort. Conrad inhaled sharply, a ragged, wet sound against Toby's collarbone. He clung to the Omega, his fingers digging painfully into Toby's cheap t-shirt. For 10 agonizing minutes, the seizure tore through Nora's fragile body. Brenda worked frantically, injecting something into her thigh, shouting for them to keep her steady. Toby held the dying woman's head, and he held her drowning son. Then the thrashing stopped. The shrill medical alarm abruptly cut off. Brenda had pulled the plug on the monitor. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise. It was the absolute, crushing silence of a void. Brenda sat back on her heels, her chest heaving. She pressed 2 fingers against Nora's throat. She held them there for a long time. Then she let her hand drop to her lap. She looked at Conrad, her expression softening into something pitying and terribly final. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hayes," Brenda whispered. Conrad didn't move. He kept his face buried in Toby's neck, his breathing hitching. Toby stared at the ceiling, feeling the dead weight of Nora against his thigh and the suffocating, desperate weight of Conrad against his chest. The burnt sugar scent mixed with the bitter tang of grief, settling into the fabric of the rug, into the walls, into their skin. There was no magic left, just the raw, jagged edges of survival. The morning sun reflected off the fresh snow, glaring through the windows with a blinding, indifferent brightness. The sitting room was empty. The medical equipment had been wheeled away. The armchair was pushed back into its proper corner. The Persian rug had been scrubbed clean. Toby stood by the heavy oak doors, wearing his winter coat, a ratty wool scarf wrapped tight around his neck. He held a small duffel bag containing his uniform. He was officially clocking out. The job was done. Mrs. Gable had handed him an envelope in the kitchen 10 minutes ago. It contained a check for double his weekly pay and a brief, stiff thank you. He was instructed to take the rest of the week off and return to general cleaning duty on Monday. Back to the bleach. Back to the mudrooms. He stared at the spot on the floor where he had sat for nearly 2 months. It felt like walking away from a car crash. He was numb. You're leaving. Toby turned. Conrad stood in the hallway. He looked entirely hollowed out. He was wearing the same sweatpants from the night before, but he had pulled a dark sweater over his chest. His eyes were red-rimmed, the dark circles bruised deep into his skin. He didn't smell like ozone or pepper anymore. He just smelled like dust and cold air, an alpha without a pack. "My shift is over, sir," Toby said quietly. His voice sounded thin in the massive corridor. "Mrs. Gable gave me my severance for the caretaking role. I'm back on the main staff." Conrad stepped forward. His movements were sluggish. "I told Gable to double your salary." "She did. Thank you. It'll cover Maya's clinic bill and then some." Toby tightened his grip on the strap of his duffel bag. He needed to get out of this house. The air was too thick. The memory of Conrad's face pressed into his neck burned like a brand against his skin. "I should go. The plows just cleared the main drive. I need to get home." Conrad stopped 3 feet away. He looked at Toby, his eyes tracing the line of his jaw, the dark bags under his eyes, the cheap fabric of his coat. "Don't go back to the cleaning staff," Conrad said. His voice was a harsh rasp. Toby's spine stiffened. The defensive walls, battered and broken over the last few weeks, instantly shot back up. "I need a job, Mr. Hayes. I don't need charity. The arrangement is over." "It's not charity." Conrad took another step closer, invading Toby's space. The faint hum of alpha heat radiated from him, sparking against the chill of the hallway. "I want you to stay in the East Wing." Toby laughed, a short, bitter sound. "To do what? Dust the baseboards? Sing to an empty chair?" "She's gone, Conrad." It was the first time he had used the Alpha's first name to his face. The sound of it hung between them, dangerous and familiar. Conrad's jaw clenched. He reached out, his hand wrapping around the strap of Toby's duffel bag, stopping the Omega from turning away. "I know she's gone." "Then let me go," Toby pleaded, his voice cracking. He looked up, his greenish-brown eyes swimming with unshed tears. The exhaustion was absolute. "I can't do this anymore. I can't be your emotional support animal. I'm tired. I just want to go home to my sister." Conrad stared down at him. The iron control, the billionaire facade, shattered completely. He dropped the bag strap and stepped into Toby's space, crowding him against the heavy oak door. He didn't touch him, but he was everywhere. "Then let me come with you," Conrad whispered, his voice cracking, laying his throat bare. Toby stopped breathing. The scent of burnt sugar flared instantly, swirling with pure shock. "This house is a graveyard," Conrad said, his dark eyes locked intensely on Toby's. "I have spent my entire life building an empire of glass and concrete, and none of it meant a damn thing last night. The only thing that kept me from tearing my own skin off was you." Conrad raised his hand slowly, his knuckles brushing against the cheap wool of Toby's scarf, right over his scent gland. "You said you couldn't afford this kind of mess. I know. I know I am a disaster right now. I know I am asking for something I haven't earned." He swallowed hard. "But if you walk out that door and go back to scrubbing floors, I'm going to lose my mind. Let me take care of Maya. Let me take care of you. Just don't leave me alone in the quiet." Toby stared at the man in front of him. This wasn't a CEO demanding compliance. This was an alpha begging for an anchor. Toby's hands were shaking. He reached up, his fingers hesitating for a fraction of a second before curling into the front of Conrad's thick sweater. He pulled gently. Conrad collapsed forward, burying his face in the crook of Toby's neck, exactly where he had been hours before. Toby wrapped his arms around the alpha's broad back, feeling the heavy, ragged exhale shudder through Conrad's frame. The scent in the hallway finally settled. It wasn't the sharp bite of fear or the sour tang of grief. It was ozone and rain, wrapping securely around the warm, grounding sweetness of caramelized sugar. "Okay," Toby whispered into the dark hair. "Okay, but you're paying for the cab." If you felt the heartbreak and the healing in Toby and Conrad's story, hit that like button. This drama proves that sometimes the most broken pieces fit together perfectly, and survival isn't just about money, it's about finding an anchor in the storm. Share this with your friends who love raw, deeply grounded Omegaverse stories that focus on human connection over cliches. What was your favorite moment between the CEO and the Maid? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another intense emotional audio drama.